September 29, 1982. The date is etched into the annals of American criminal history not merely as a day of tragedy, but as the moment the illusion of domestic safety was shattered forever. In the quiet, unassuming suburb of Elk Grove Village, Illinois, the morning began with a mundane rhythm of a school day. Mary Kellerman, a 12-year-old girl whose life was an unfolding tapestry of school projects, friendships, and the gentle anxieties of adolescence, awoke feeling the familiar, unwelcome tightness of a seasonal cold. It was, by all accounts, a trivial inconvenience, a scratchy throat, a slight increase in body temperature, the predictable physiological tax of a changing season. Her parents, vigilant and caring, operated with the instinctual caution that defined suburban parenting in the 1980s. They did not rush to an emergency room for a common cold. Instead, they turned to the bathroom medicine cabinet, that small, porcelain-tiled sanctuary of household health that stood as a bastion against the minor maladies of daily life. Inside, there sat a bottle of McNeil Consumer Products, Extra-Strength Tylenol. At the time, Tylenol was not just a medication. It was a cultural monolith, a brand synonymous with reliability, safety, and the sophisticated promise of fast-acting relief. It was a product that had earned a place in the homes of millions, trusted with the same quiet reverence as the family Bible or the photograph album. Mary, eager to clear her head so she could attend her classes and maintain her academic rhythm, followed her parents' suggestion. She took a single capsule. It was a singular, fatal decision that would cascade into a nightmare of unprecedented proportions. The poison, a substance hidden with surgical, chilling precision, began its work immediately. The compound used was potassium cyanide, a chemical of devastating potency, odorless, tasteless, and capable of arresting cellular respiration within seconds. As Mary walked back down the hallway, the world around her began to lose its focus. Her lungs, starved of the ability to process the oxygen her body so desperately demanded, failed her. She collapsed heavily onto the floor, a sound that would soon echo in the homes of several other victims across the state. Her parents rushed to her side, their confusion turning into frantic terror as they witnessed their daughter succumbing to an invisible foe. Paramedics were summoned, their sirens slicing through the quiet suburb, but the medical intervention was, by then, a futile gesture against a chemical weapon masquerading as medicine. At 7 a.m., the life of a 12-year-old girl was officially declared extinguished. The authorities, acting under the protocols of the time, initially processed the event as an unexplained medical anomaly, perhaps a cardiac arrest or a severe, undiagnosed systemic failure. There was no immediate reason to suspect a conspiracy of mass murder. After all, the world was built on the foundation that the products we purchased from the store were exactly what they claimed to be. This was an era of profound institutional trust. The thought that someone had infiltrated the supply chain, reached into the sanctuary of the retail shelf, and replaced life-saving medicine with a lethal agent was not just terrifying. It was, in the minds of the investigators, statistically impossible. The tragedy of the Kellerman home was a quiet prologue to a storm. It was the first tremor of an industrial and social earthquake that would soon dismantle the American public's faith in corporate transparency and product safety. The investigators tasked with the case were searching for a medical explanation, failing to realize that the phantom of the 1982 Tylenol crisis was already moving. This was a crime of anonymous, calculated cruelty. Every second that passed was an opportunity for the architect of this tragedy to refine their process, to wait for the next victim to reach into their medicine cabinet, to wait for the next unsuspecting household to succumb to the medicine they had provided. The silence of the morning was a veil. Behind it, a nightmare was unfolding that would necessitate the complete reconstruction of the Food and Drug Administration's manufacturing requirements. To understand the depth of this crime, one must look at the silence before the storm, the quiet normalcy of Elk Grove Village before it was redefined as the site of a chemical attack. It was a day of absolute, devastating ordinariness, the kind that precedes profound systemic change. The parents, grieving in a house that suddenly felt too empty, could not have known they were the first casualties of a domestic terror campaign. The death of Mary Kellerman was the catalyst, the spark that would soon burn through the entire infrastructure of American commerce. As we analyze this opening movement of the tragedy, it is crucial to recognize the weight of what was lost, not just a young life, but the collective innocence of a nation that trusted its medicine cabinets implicitly. The medicine cabinet, once a symbol of care, was being transformed into the most dangerous corner of the American home. The trap had been set, and the first prey had already been taken. The morning of September 29, 1982, was the threshold. We crossed it. Now, we proceed into the dark heart of the crisis. The timeline of the horror shifted abruptly from the suburban tragedy of Elk Grove Village to the more complex, agonizing collapse of the Janus family in Arlington Heights. If the death of Mary Kellerman was a singular, isolated shock, the events that transpired in the home of Adam Janus were the definitive evidence of a targeted, systematic campaign of terror. Adam, a 27-year-old postal worker with short dark hair and an earnest demeanor, characterized by his blue 1980s Postal Service uniform, returned from his morning shift on that same fateful Wednesday. He was a man defined by the rhythm of his daily labor, his life punctuated by the delivery of mail, and the quiet stability of his domestic sphere. Yet, as he entered his kitchen, that brightly lit, linoleum-floored heart of the Janus household, he carried with him a fatigue that felt heavier than usual. It was a pounding, rhythmic ache in his skull, the kind of physiological pressure that demands immediate mitigation. Adam, much like Mary, acted with the instinctive reliance on the Tylenol bottle he had purchased that very morning. He reached for the extra-strength variant, a choice made in the hope of returning to a state of normalcy before the evening took hold. The capsules were ingested, the water swallowed, and the process of chemical warfare began within his own cardiovascular system. Within minutes, the efficacy of the toxin was demonstrated with brutal, terrifying efficiency. Adam did not die of a subtle malaise. He suffered a catastrophic, violent systemic failure. He collapsed onto the kitchen floor, his body racked by involuntary rhythmic convulsions that signaled the rapid depletion of oxygen at the cellular level. His lungs, locked in a spasm of paralysis, could no longer pull the air he so desperately required to sustain his consciousness. When his family members discovered him, the scene was one of chaotic, unanswerable trauma. Paramedics arrived, their equipment and urgency unable to combat the sheer, focused potency of the cyanide that was systematically dismantling Adam's internal architecture. The shock of his death was not merely the loss of a brother or a husband. It was the abruptness of the exit. The Janus family, initially stunned into a state of catatonic disbelief, gathered the home to share in the communal burden of their grief. It was an environment of intense, suffocating stress, a pressure cooker of raw human emotion where the air itself felt heavy with the weight of the unspoken. Among those gathered were Stanley Janus, a 25-year-old male with facial features remarkably similar to his brother Adam, marked by the same short dark hair and a somber expression often cloaked in a dark casual sweater, and his young wife, Teresa Janus, 19, with wavy blonde hair and an air of fragile grace, often seen in her beige knitted cardigan. The environment within the Janus residence was a microcosm of the tragedy's ripple effect. The collective cortisol levels in the room were reaching a breaking point. The stress of the loss acted as an accelerant, a feedback loop of emotional and physical depletion. Stanley, struggling to process the sudden void left by his brother's departure, began to suffer from the same splitting, cranial pressure that Adam had attempted to resolve hours earlier. Teresa, overwhelmed by the sight of her husband's grief and the surreal nature of the day's events, also found herself captive to a debilitating headache. In their vulnerability, they reached for the same bottle of Tylenol, the very container that had been the instrument of Adam's demise. The tragedy was not an accident. It was a cyclical, repeating event. Stanley administered the dose, and with an act of misplaced compassion, he handed a portion of the medication to Teresa. The sequence of events that followed is a harrowing testament to the efficiency of the poison. Seconds after ingestion, Stanley collapsed on the living room rug, a sudden, heavy mass of stillness in a room that was supposed to be a place of mourning. Teresa, disoriented and witnessing the impossible, fell beside him, her respiratory system locking in the same silent, lethal embrace that had claimed the other two. The Janus home had become an epicenter of death. The medical teams who arrived to find the brothers and the wife in varying states of expiration were forced to confront a reality that defied all medical precedent. It was not a fluke. It was a cluster. In the span of a single afternoon, the fabric of the Janus family had been unspooled by a source that appeared, at that moment, to be entirely benign. As the forensic teams began their work, they were mapping a disaster that was rapidly moving beyond the confines of a single household. The Janus family tragedy was the pivot point upon which the entire investigation turned. It provided the first hard evidence that this was not a localized misfortune, but coordinated, lethal intrusion. The emotional aftermath for the surviving relatives, left to navigate a world where a bottle of pills could be a death sentence, was profound. They were the primary witnesses to a crime that had no face, no motive, and no mercy. The silence of the Janus home, once a place of family gatherings and shared history, was now the site of an ongoing cold investigation. As we dissect this sequence, we must appreciate the cold, clinical horror of the family's experience. They were not merely victims. They were the unfortunate pioneers of a trauma that would define the consumer experience for generations. It was the moment the Janus family entered the history books, not for the lives they had led, but for the arbitrary, vicious manner in which those lives were taken. This was a dark intersection of domestic intimacy and industrial sabotage, a moment where the tragedy scaled from individual loss to a wider, systemic panic. The realization that the Janus family had been struck by a localized chemical attack forced a shift in the investigative strategy. The focus moved from the hospital rooms to the laboratory, where the tools of forensic science were poised to reveal a level of malice previously unimaginable. Dr. Thomas Kim, the physician overseeing the Janus crisis, began to piece together the commonalities that linked the disparate deaths. His communication with the firefighters and paramedics on the scene, Philip Capitelli and Richard Keyworth, was the catalyst for a breakthrough that would change the trajectory of the investigation. They had observed a common denominator in the household inventories: Tylenol bottle. When Dr. Kim opened the container recovered from the Janus household, he was greeted not by the sterile, chalky scent of medicine, but by a distinct, sharp, and sickly sweet aroma. It was the scent of bitter almonds, a sensory signature that has haunted toxicologists since the birth of modern chemistry. This was the unmistakable, textbook hallmark of cyanide. The subsequent analysis conducted by Chief Toxicologist Michael Schaefer turned the situation from a tragedy into a full-scale, national emergency. The laboratory setting was a flurry of activity, an environment characterized by the buzzing of industrial lights, the clinical coldness of stainless steel surfaces, and the meticulous, rhythmic clinking of glass beakers and test vials. Schaefer's team conducted a comprehensive chemical screening, disassembling the capsules that had been retrieved from the homes of the victims. What they found was a level of preparation that suggested a cold, calculated methodology. The capsules had not simply been contaminated, they had been surgically altered. Each individual gelatin capsule had been painstakingly pried apart, its benign pain-relieving powder removed and discarded, and replaced with a lethal, concentrated dose of pure potassium cyanide. This was not the work of a distracted or amateur saboteur. It was the effort of someone who understood the logistics of manufacturing, the patience of a craftsman, and the heart of a sociopath. The quantity of the poison was alarming. While a typical lethal dose for an adult is estimated between 100 to 200 milligrams, the contaminated capsules contained over 600 milligrams. This was a deliberate attempt to ensure the fatality of the ingestion. There was no room for error, no possibility of survival. The toxin acted with a speed that bypassed the body's ability to defend itself, inhibiting the cytochrome C oxidase within the mitochondria and effectively halting cellular respiration. The victims were, in essence, suffocating while surrounded by air. The laboratory results were not merely evidence. They were a death warrant for the Tylenol brand and a red flag for the entire country. The forensic experts at the lab, working around the clock under the glare of sterile tubes, identified the specific crystalline structure of the powder, noting the presence of microscopic moisture trapped within the lattice, a sign that the chemical was handled in bulk before being placed into the capsules. This revelation of the how did not immediately answer the who, but it provided the FBI with a profile of the predator. This individual was a tactical operator, someone who could walk into a retail establishment, identify the shelf space, and swap a genuine product for a lethal one without alerting the staff or the other customers. The sophistication of the tampering necessitated a shift in the law enforcement approach. This was no longer a homicide case, but a hunt for an active, ongoing threat. As the laboratory staff continued their analysis, the psychological weight of the findings began to press upon the investigators. They were looking at the residue of a human life, the small white grains that had extinguished 7 individuals in a matter of days. The laboratory documentation, the spreadsheets detailing the lot numbers, and the forensic photographs of the disassembled capsules became the primary records of the crisis. These documents did not simply track facts. They tracked the trajectory of a killer who had decided to turn the most fundamental act of a consumer, buying a product, into a game of Russian roulette. The investigation had become a race between the discovery of the contamination and the next tragedy. With each test, each confirmation of cyanide, the urgency of the recall and the public warning intensified. The laboratory, once a place of objective, detached study, became the nerve center for a nation in panic. The researchers were not looking for microbes or pathogens. They were looking for the fingerprints of a phantom. The discovery of the sabotage mechanism, the manual tampering with the gelatin shell, was the pivot point that informed every subsequent decision made by the corporate executives and the federal agents. It was a clear, unambiguous sign the poison was not in the factory, but in the store. This distinction was critical, saving the manufacturers from the accusation of systemic neglect, but placing the burden of the threat onto the open, unprotected retail environment. We see here the convergence of science and suffering, the moment when the analytical precision of the laboratory validated the chaotic reality of the family's grief. The forensic story is not merely about the poison itself, but about the transition of the investigation from a mystery into a mission to protect an entire population from a threat that was waiting in plain sight. The impact of the Tylenol poisoning crisis on Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of McNeil Consumer Products, stands as one of the most studied and praised examples of corporate crisis management in history. On the morning of September 30th, when the full gravity of the situation was presented to the executive offices, the company was faced with a choice that threatened its very existence. James Burke, the CEO at the time, was not just an executive. He was the leader of an organization that saw its premier product, an analgesic that held an astonishing 35% of the market share, transformed into an instrument of death. The corporate boardrooms were filled with the tension of potential financial ruin. Legal experts warned that a massive recall could imply liability, and shareholders were reeling from the uncertainty of the brand's future. The potential for the company to crumble under the weight of lawsuits and the permanent loss of consumer trust was palpable. Yet, Burke chose a path of unprecedented transparency and aggressive, proactive protection of the public. He ordered a total, nationwide recall of every single bottle of Tylenol, over 31 million units, with a retail value exceeding $100 million. This was not a move driven by legal necessity. It was a move driven by a philosophy of consumer safety that placed the life of the customer above the quarterly report. The logistics of this recall were staggering. It required the cooperation of thousands of retailers, the mobilization of a massive logistical network to recover, store, and eventually incinerate millions of plastic bottles, and an intensive communication strategy to reach every household in the United States. Television networks and radio stations were flooded with emergency broadcasts, the message consistent and urgent: do not consume the product, return it, and await further instruction. Johnson & Johnson was effectively erasing its most successful asset from the face of the earth, acknowledging that as long as the product remained in the hands of the public, the risk of another death remained present. The internal deliberations were a crucible of corporate accountability. While the legal advisors fretted over the implications of admitting fault, Burke maintained that the company had a duty to its users that transcended the standard corporate interest. The decision to recall was not just an act of damage control. It was a fundamental reassertion of the brand's identity. It was a message to the public that their lives were worth more than the $100 million cost of the recall. This strategic honesty allowed the company to survive, but the process was grueling. The images of workers in vast, dimly lit warehouses, filling industrial crates with white plastic bottles that would soon be reduced to ash, became the visual shorthand for the cost of the disaster. The company was literally burning its own profit to ensure the safety of the public. But the recall was only the first step. The crisis demanded a fundamental revolution in consumer packaging. The vulnerabilities that allowed the poisoner to infiltrate the supply chain had to be permanently eliminated. In the following months, the company, in collaboration with the FDA and various engineering teams, pioneered the development of the triple seal, tamper-evident packaging. This included a glued outer box, a plastic neck seal, and inner foil membrane that was hermetically sealed over the bottle opening. This design was not just a deterrent, it was a physical manifestation of a new era of retail security. The consumer, once trusting of an open bottle, was now encouraged to be the gatekeeper of their own safety, checking every seal before purchase. This shift in the consumer mindset was the most significant cultural outcome of the crisis. We transitioned from an age of implicit trust to an age of visual verification. The financial toll was massive, but the long-term impact on the industry was even more profound. Every product sold today, from medicine to food, owes its safety protocols to the lessons learned in the wake of the 1982 tragedy. The corporate story is not just one of recovery, it is one of a forced, painful evolution. Johnson & Johnson did not just survive the crisis. They set the standard for how a corporation should respond to the catastrophic misuse of its products. Yet, for all the praise the company received for its transparency, the underlying reality remained. The killer had succeeded in forcing the hand of a corporate giant. They had imposed a massive financial burden and a fundamental change in the manufacturing process. The tragedy of the victims and the subsequent action of the company were two sides of the same coin of human intervention. The corporate response serves as a reminder that even the most powerful entities can be destabilized by the focused, malicious actions of a single individual. It was a masterclass in crisis management, but one that was prompted by a crime that, to this day, has not been fully resolved by the machinery of justice, leaving a lingering void where truth should reside in the minds of the victim's kin. The national psyche during the autumn of 1982 was defined by a pervasive, suffocating sense of paranoia. The Tylenol crisis had stripped away the facade of order, revealing that the retail aisles of the country were, in fact, hunting grounds. The FBI, facing a crisis of intelligence, launched a task force that would become one of the most intense and exhausting in the history of the Bureau. Over 100 federal agents, augmented by a legion of state investigators and homicide detectives, were deployed to map the movements of a killer who moved with the stealth of a phantom. The task force was confronted with a logistical nightmare. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, where the needle had the capacity to kill anyone who touched it. Every piece of intelligence, every tip from a nervous clerk, every report of a suspicious individual lurking near a pharmacy was pursued with an exhausting intensity. The investigators reviewed thousands of hours of grainy, low-fidelity VHS security tapes from stores across Illinois. They spent their days in darkened rooms, eyes strained by the relentless flicker of monochrome monitors, searching for the slightest deviation in human behavior. They were looking for the tamperer, the individual who had entered a store, bypassed the clerk, and replaced the capsules in the time it took to glance away. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of logistics. The investigation spanned several jurisdictions, from Walgreens pharmacies to Jewel-Osco grocery stores, and the profile of the perpetrator remained frustratingly elusive. The public's response was a mix of intense fear and civil unrest. Schools, offices, and neighborhood associations issued warnings. People began to dispose of any and all medication that came in capsule form, fearing that the contamination was far more widespread than the official report suggested. This was the era of the copycat, a phenomenon that the FBI feared above all else. The media coverage, constant and alarmist, fueled the fire, turning every minor report of discomfort into a potential poisoning. The local precinct operations in Chicago were completely overwhelmed by an avalanche of false leads, civilian hysteria, and requests for updates. Thousands of calls jammed the switchboards, and investigators were constantly diverted from legitimate clues to address the fears of the public. Every discarded bottle found in a park, every pill discovered in a trash can, triggered a hazardous materials response. The task force was forced to seal off public spaces, divert emergency resources, and dedicate time to what were, in almost every instance, false alarms or misunderstandings. This dilution of resources was exactly what the perpetrator wanted, a climate of total chaos where the real trail was lost in a forest of noise. The FBI agents involved in the hunt later described the atmosphere as one of perpetual, low-grade dread. They were not just fighting a killer, they were fighting the degradation of a society's trust in its own infrastructure. The hunt led them through the web of cheap hotels, the shadowy corners of the Chicago suburbs, and the psychological landscape of every person who possessed the skill and the anger to commit such an act. The profile of the suspect continued to evolve as the data points grew. Was it a disgruntled former employee? A failed professional seeking revenge on the industry? Or perhaps a sociopath who found satisfaction in the sheer scale of the panic? As we move through this period of the investigation, we see the limitations of the technology of the time. Without the benefit of modern DNA tracking or the massive digital footprint of today, the investigators were forced to rely on handwriting analysis, witness testimonies, and the grueling old-school footwork of federal agents. It was a hunt defined by perseverance, but also by the persistent feeling that they were one step behind a perpetrator who was watching the news, laughing at the chaos they had wrought. The paranoia was not just a reaction, it was a strategic component of the crime. By forcing the nation to fear its own shadow, the perpetrator had achieved a level of dominance that was terrifyingly absolute. The panic was the weapon, and the killer had an infinite supply of ammunition. As the task force continued its work, the weight of the unsolved cases, the lives lost and the lives interrupted, became a burden that defined their existence. They were the thin line between a society of trust and a society of fear, and for that autumn in 1982, that line was being relentlessly tested by an adversary who showed no signs of stopping. The investigation took a dramatic turn with the discovery of an extortion note sent to the Johnson & Johnson corporate offices. Postmarked from Chicago, The letter demanded $1 million to be deposited into a specific bank account in exchange for ending the poisonings. This was the first tangible evidence, a potential window into the identity of the person who held the nation hostage. The FBI, utilizing the financial data provided in the note, traced the account to a defunct travel agency whose owners were, upon interrogation, found to be entirely uninvolved. The perpetrator had stolen the banking credentials, demonstrating a sophistication that indicated they were not just a poisoner, but experienced criminal capable of navigating corporate and financial systems. The handwriting on the note was analyzed by a team of experts, and the forensic trails pointed toward a prime suspect, James Lewis. Lewis was a man with a complex, dark history. An accountant by profession, his life was marked by a series of fraudulent dealings, a volatile psychological profile, and an erratic history of criminal behavior. When the FBI converged on the potential suspect, Lewis fled, setting off a nationwide manhunt that spanned from Chicago to the streets of New York. The pursuit was a high-stakes, cinematic drama. Agents tracked him through a network of cheap residential hotels, where he would leave behind taunting, cryptic letters addressed to local newspapers, challenging the authorities to catch him. The investigation of Lewis became the focal point of the task force's efforts. His background, his movements, and his knowledge of the financial system made him a terrifyingly plausible suspect. However, as the agents delved into his life, they were faced with a frustrating, consistent gap in the evidence. While they could prove his involvement in the extortion, the desire for the money, the planning, the theft of the accounts, they could not establish a concrete physical link to the act of tampering. They combed through his past residences, his travel routes, and his personal belongings, but they found no trace of potassium cyanide, no manufacturing tools, and no chemical residue. There were no witnesses who could place Lewis inside the specific grocery aisles of Chicago during the critical tampering window. The prosecution was a nightmare of legal technicalities. The case against Lewis was built on the extortion, and it was on these grounds that he was eventually convicted. He was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary, a punishment that the public deemed insufficient given the scale of the horror. For the FBI task force, the conviction of Lewis was a victory, but was hollow. The tactical profile of the true poisoner, the individual who meticulously dismantled the capsules and replaced the medicine with cyanide, did not align with the erratic, opportunistic nature of Lewis. The investigation remained open, the agents haunted by the possibility that while they had caught the person trying to profit from the tragedy, they had missed the individual who had caused it. This reality was a bitter pill for the law enforcement teams to swallow. They were left with the conviction of a fraudster, but the shadow of the poisoner lingered, untouched and unpunished. The legal proceedings highlighted the limits of a justice system designed to punish clear, direct actions, but which was often ill-equipped to untangle the motives of a predator who combined financial crimes with chemical terrorism. The public remained uneasy. The conviction did little to restore the sense of security that had been so violently discarded. The saga of James Lewis serves as a reminder of the complexity of criminal intent, where one person might seize the opportunity of a catastrophe to advance their own greed, while the primary villain remains hidden in the background, a silent architect of death. As we explore this chapter, we see the divergence between the crime of extortion and the crime of mass murder, and how the pursuit of the former left the true nature of the latter in a state of unresolved, tragic ambiguity. The decades following the conviction of James Lewis were characterized by the slow, grinding erosion of the investigation. As the 1980s gave way to the 90s, the Tylenol murders migrated from the front pages of the newspapers into the dusty, archived stacks of the FBI's cold case division. The files grew thick with unproven theories, dead-end leads, and the persistent nagging feeling that the case had been surrendered to the passage of time. Yet, the story did not die. It entered a phase of institutional stasis. The mystery became a fixture in the history of true crime, a riddle that refused to be solved. In the background, investigators occasionally circled back to other figures of interest. One such figure was Roger Arnold, a warehouse dock worker whose documented history of paranoid grudges and threats against his employer had made him an early suspect. Rumors persisted for years that Arnold possessed a secret supply of industrial chemicals in his basement, a claim that the task force investigated with great interest but was never able to substantiate with physical evidence. The lead eventually evaporated, contributing to the growing pile of what-ifs that defined the case. In 2009, on the 27th anniversary of the tragedy, the FBI, spurred by advances in technology and a renewed public interest, launched a surprise, comprehensive forensic review of the case. Agents raided the home of an aging James Lewis, who had long since been released from prison in Massachusetts. They seized his personal computers, his old typewriters, and any documents that could be subjected to modern digital age analysis. The goal was to see if the advances in molecular tracking or digital forensics could bridge the gap that had eluded the investigators in the 80s. It was a desperate attempt to find the missing link, a final, concerted effort to give the families the closure they had been denied for nearly 3 decades. However, the results of the forensic sweep were, once again, inconclusive. The chemical compositions of the toxins had degraded beyond the point of reliable molecular tracking, and the data trails of the pre-digital age were too fragmented to be reconstructed by contemporary algorithms. The suspect remained free, the mystery remained unsolved, and the task force was forced to acknowledge that some crimes, regardless of the effort invested, are destined to remain in the realm of the permanent unknown. This phase of the investigation highlights the cruel limitations of time. As the years increased, the biological and digital traces of the crime were steadily reclaimed by entropy. The case moved from a police mystery into the realm of history, a topic for documentaries and academic discourse rather than an active criminal pursuit. We see in this period the intersection of human desperation and technological progress, where each new tool of science was brought to bear on the same old, cold evidence, and each time the evidence stayed silent. The passage of time was the poisoner's greatest ally. As the victims' families aged, and the original investigators retired or moved on, the Tylenol case became a legacy of unanswered questions. It serves as a study in the persistence of cold cases, where the hunt is no longer about catching an active predator, but about the preservation of truth in the face of oblivion. The failure to resolve the case, despite the technological leaps of the 21st century, serves as a stark reminder that some enigmas are inherently tied to the moment of their occurrence, and once that moment passes, the truth may be lost forever. The case continued to haunt the corridors of the FBI, a reminder of a failure that spanned a generation. As we look at this era of stagnation, we are forced to confront the idea that in some cases, the perpetrator's greatest victory was not the murder itself, but their successful disappearance into the shadows of history, leaving us only the questions. In July 2023, the chapter on the Tylenol murders reached a final, quiet conclusion with the death of James Lewis at the age of 76. With his passing, the primary living link to the active investigation was permanently severed. Whatever secrets Lewis might have possessed, whatever knowledge he had regarding the architect of the poisonings, were taken to the grave. The files in the FBI archives, representing over 20,000 pages of theory, evidence, and frustration, remain sealed. The mystery of 1982 has become a fixed point in the American consciousness, a tragedy that serves as a permanent reference for the dangers of an unprotected society. The legacy of the Tylenol poisonings is not found in a courtroom verdict. It is found in the everyday, mundane actions of millions of people who have never heard the names of Mary Kellerman or Adam Janis. Every time a consumer breaks a plastic ring, peels back a foil seal, or inspects a box for signs of interference, they are participating in a ritual that was established as a direct result of the 1982 crisis. We live in the world that the poisoner created, a world where trust must be verified by technology, where the retail shelf is a battlefield of security, and where the assumption of safety is a privilege that must be actively guarded. The impact of the case on the legal landscape of the United States was total. The federal government established new manufacturing standards that made tampering a high-stakes criminal offense, and the pharmaceutical industry was forced to undergo a total overhaul of its safety and packaging protocols. The emotional scars, however, were never subject to federal reform. The families of the 7 original victims were left with a lifetime of unanswered questions, a void where there should have been justice. Their story is a silent testament to a senseless, domestic terror campaign that shattered the normalcy of their lives and forced them to live in the long shadow of an unpunished crime. As we conclude this dossier, we are left with the chilling realization that the poisoner of 1982 was the most effective terrorist in American history. They forced a fundamental shift in the social contract of the nation, they bankrupted a massive logistical operation, and they ultimately vanished, leaving no definitive footprint for the world to follow. The ghost of the Tylenol killer serves as a reminder of the fragility of the societal order and the devastating potential of a singular malicious intent. We close the file on this case not because the answer has been found, but because the path to the answer has been effectively erased by time. The mystery is a permanent, haunting feature of the historical record, a ghost story that is entirely, devastatingly real. As we look back at the arc of this tragedy, from the first capsule in Cook County to the quiet death of the final suspect in 2023, we see the full trajectory of a crime that changed the world. It was a failure of the system, a masterclass in the creation of fear, and a testament to the fact that sometimes the most horrific truths are the ones that are never spoken. The case is officially cold, the archive is permanently closed, and the name of the killer will likely remain a secret shared only by the dead. The silence that follows this case is the final, most enduring legacy of the poisoner, a silence that speaks volumes about the limits of human knowledge and the persistent, unyielding shadow cast by an unsolved crime. We leave the memory of Mary, Adam, Stanley, and Teresa as the primary objects of our respect, their lives having been the currency with which the modern safety standards were paid for. Their story is now history, a fixed point of horror in the American landscape, and the final dossier is now finally complete, marking the end of our investigation.